New York City, February 11th, 1951. A bone-chilling morning in Little Italy. The air inside the Ravenite Social Club is thick, not just with the smell of expensive espresso and stale cigar smoke, but with the suffocating weight of power. At a corner table, surrounded by a circle of stone-faced capos, sits Albert Anastasia. They call him the Lord High Executioner, a man who has ordered hundreds of deaths and felt the heartbeat of the underworld in his very palms. He is laughing. He's, laughing at a warning from a man uptown, a man named Bumpy Johnson. But then the heavy oak door creaks open. A delivery. No return address. Just a box wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to Anastasia in a handwriting so neat it feels like a threat. The laughter in the room dies instantly. You can hear the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, matching the sudden frantic thumping in the lieutenant's chests. One soldier reaches for his coat, his hand hovering over a snub-nosed revolver. "Could be a bomb, Albert," he whispers, his voice cracking. Anastasia doesn't flinch. He stares at the package for what feels like an eternity, his eyes narrowing. He knows where it came from. He knows that in the Harlem streets, Bumpy doesn't send gifts. He sends messages. With a steady hand, Anastasia tears the paper. The sound of the ripping parchment is like a gunshot in the silent room. He lifts the lid. The smirk on his face doesn't just fade, it evaporates. His skin goes pale, the color of a winter fog. His breath hitches. Inside that box is something so devastating, so personal, that the most violent mob boss in American history suddenly looks like a man who just saw his own ghost. What could possibly be in a simple gift box that would make a god of the mafia tremble? How did a king from Harlem silence the 5 families without saying a single word? Would you have had the courage to open that box? Or more importantly, would you have let the man who sent it walk out alive? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. I need to know your take on this. And if you're ready to see the move that changed Harlem forever, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss how this game of chess ends. To understand the weight of that box, we have to travel back 3 weeks. The year is 1951, and Harlem isn't just a neighborhood, it's a fortress. At the center of it all sits Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. But don't let the title of gangster fool you. In the eyes of the people on 125th Street, Bumpy was more than a numbers runner. Illegally or not, he was the only man standing between them and the wolves at the gate. While the rest of the world saw a criminal, the Harlem streets saw a benefactor. He was the one who paid the rent when the landlord came knocking with an eviction notice. He was the one who filled the coal heaters when the winter frost started biting through the thin walls of the tenements. He was a king in a pinstripe suit, holding court at the St. Nicholas pub, moving with a quiet gravity that commanded more respect than any badge or uniform ever could. But 3 weeks before the incident at the Ravenite, a cold wind started blowing from downtown. The 5 families, the heavy hitters of the Italian syndicate, had grown tired of the boundaries. They didn't just want a piece of the drug trade. They wanted the soul of Harlem. They looked at Bumpy and saw an obstacle that needed to be cleared. They underestimated him. They saw a man limited by the color of his skin and the borders of his neighborhood, failing to realize they were dealing with a chess master who studied Machiavelli in the dark. Albert Anastasia, a man who built his throne on a mountain of bodies, decided it was time to test the waters. He started sending his tax collectors into Bumpy's territory, disrupting the flow and threatening the local shopkeepers. It was a classic move of intimidation, the giant leaning on the smaller man just to see him buckle. But Bumpy didn't buckle. He didn't send a crew of gunmen to spray the street in a blind rage. Instead, he watched. He waited. He walked through the Harlem night, his eyes absorbing every detail, every face, every whisper. He knew that a war with the Italians wouldn't be won with more bullets, but with better leverage. He was David facing a Goliath that had all the resources in the world, but lacked the one thing. Bumpy had in abundance the absolute loyalty of the streets. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a switchblade. People stopped talking when Bumpy walked by, not out of fear, but out of a heavy, solemn anticipation. They knew a storm was coming. The Italians were arrogant. thinking their numbers and their connections made them untouchable. They didn't realize that Bumpy Johnson had already turned the very streets they walked on into a trap. Now I want to ask you something. Do you believe a man like Bumpy can truly be called a hero if he uses the proceeds of crime to protect his community? Is it possible for a villain to be a neighborhood's greatest savior? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This is where the debate gets real. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the untold legends of the underworld, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started. While Bumpy Johnson was playing the long game, the Italians were growing impatient. Albert, Anastasia, and the 5 families didn't just want to fight a war. They wanted to buy one. They knew that every man, no matter how loyal he seems, has a price or a breaking point. They decided to skip the street brawls and go straight for the foundation of Bumpy's power. They began looking for the cracks in the Harlem wall, searching for someone close to the king who might be willing to trade their soul for a seat at a different table. Imagine a late-night meeting in the back of a dimly lit social club in East Harlem. The air is heavy with the scent of expensive pomade, espresso, and the metallic tang of hidden revolvers. A man named Tony, the banker, a top lieutenant for the Gambinos, sat across from one of Bumpy's most trusted street captains. On the table between them sat a leather briefcase, cracked open just enough to reveal the mesmerizing green glow of $50,000 in cold, hard cash. In 1951, that wasn't just money. It was a ticket out of the struggle, a new life, a way to never have to look over your shoulder again. Tony leaned forward, the light catching the gold ring on his pinky finger. "Bumpy is a legend, sure," he whispered, his voice smooth like aged whiskey. "But legends have a habit of dying young. Why die with him when you can live with us? This is just the beginning. Harlem is a gold mine, and we're the ones with the shovels. All we need is for you to look the other way for one night. Just one night." The temptation was suffocating. You could see the sweat beading on the captain's forehead, the way his eyes kept darting back to that briefcase. He thought about his mother's medical bills, the crumbling apartment he lived in, and the sheer, overwhelming power of the 5 families. The mafia wasn't just offering money. They were offering a choice between a sinking ship and a luxury liner. They painted Bumpy as a relic of the past, a man holding on to a neighborhood that the world was moving away from. They wanted this captain to believe that loyalty to Bumpy was a death sentence, while betrayal was a promotion. This is where the psychological warfare truly began. The Italians didn't just offer cash, they planted seeds of doubt. They whispered about Bumpy's secret deals, claiming he was already selling out his own people behind their backs. It was a masterclass in manipulation. They wanted to turn Bumpy's greatest strength, his brotherhood, into his greatest vulnerability. They waited for the greed to override the years of shared history, for the fear of Anastasia's murder inc. to outweigh the respect for the man who had fed them when they were hungry. But what they didn't realize was that in Harlem, the air itself had ears. Every whispered bribe, every secret meeting in the shadows, and every lingering look at a bribe was being recorded in the mind of the streets. Bumpy had built a network of unnoticeables, the shoe shine boys, the jazz singers, the waitresses at the Cotton Club who saw everything. While the Italians thought they were being discreet, they were actually performing on a stage where Bumpy Johnson held the front row seat. The drama of this moment lies in the silence. It's the sound of a man weighing his life against his honor. The mafia's offer wasn't just a business proposal. It was a test of the Harlem spirit. They underestimated the bond that Bumpy had forged, a bond not built on fear, but on a shared struggle. They thought they could buy Harlem because they viewed it as a commodity, but to Bumpy and his people, it was a home, and you don't sell your home to the people trying to burn it down. As the meeting ended, the briefcase remained on the table, a silent temptress in the dark. The decision made in that room would ripple across New York, setting the stage for a confrontation that no one saw coming. The Italians walked away thinking they had bought a traitor. Bumpy Johnson walked away knowing he had found a target. Now I have to ask you, if you were standing in that dim room looking at more money than your family has ever seen, would you have the strength to say no? Is loyalty worth more than a secure future? Tell me the truth in the comments. I want to see where you draw the line. And if you're ready to see how Bumpy turned this betrayal into his greatest weapon, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. The next chapter is where the chess master reveals his hand. The mafia believed they had successfully planted a virus inside Bumpy's organization. They thought the $50,000 had bought them a window into the king's soul. But what Albert Anastasia and his capos failed to understand was that in Bumpy's Harlem, even the shadows were on the payroll. Bumpy didn't just have an ear to the ground, he owned the ground itself. Before the ink on the mafia's bribery plan was even dry, Bumpy was sitting in his private office above the St. Nicholas pub, listening to a full report of every word whispered in that dim social club. He didn't react with a fit of rage. He didn't order a hit on the captain who had sat across from Tony the banker. Instead, Bumpy Johnson did something far more terrifying. He smiled. He realized that the Italians' arrogance was their greatest weakness. They assumed he would react like a common thug, with blood and bullets. But Bumpy knew that a war of attrition with the five families would only leave Harlem in ruins. To win, he needed to strike at the one thing a mafia boss values more than life itself, his sense of absolute security. Bumpy's secret plan didn't involve mobilizing an army. It involved a surgical, psychological strike. He gathered a small elite circle of men whose loyalty wasn't just proven, but forged in the fires of past street wars. He told them, "We aren't going to kill them. We're going to show them that we're all ready." Inside their house. This was the birth of the chessmaster strategy. While the Italians were busy planning an invasion of the Harlem numbers racket, Bumpy was busy mapping out the private lives of the mafia's elite. For 2 weeks, Bumpy's unnoticeables moved like ghosts through the streets of Little Italy and the suburbs where the bosses lived. They weren't looking for drug stashes or counting soldiers. They were looking for the small things, the things that make a powerful man feel vulnerable. They found out which school Albert Anastasia's children attended. They found out where his wife bought her groceries. They identified the private garden where the Lord High Executioner liked to sit alone and drink his morning coffee. They were gathering the ingredients for a message that would resonate louder than any bomb. Bumpy knew that Anastasia's power was built on a myth of invincibilidade. If Bumpy could shatter that myth, the war would be over before it truly began. He began orchestrating the contents of the mysterious box we saw at the beginning of our story. It wasn't just a threat. It was a dossier of total exposure. He compiled photographs, detailed schedules, and personal items that could only have been obtained by someone standing inches away from the mafia's inner sanctum. But the strategy went deeper. Bumpy used his connections within the city's political and police infrastructure, connections he had cultivated for decades by being a man of his word. He ensured that if a war did break out, the heat from the authorities would fall squarely on the Italians, not on Harlem. He was setting a trap where every move the mafia made would lead them deeper into a quagmire of legal trouble and public scrutiny. He was weaponizing the system against the very people who thought they owned it. As the deadline for the mafia's takeover approached, Bumpy's associates grew nervous. They saw the Italian soldiers gathering at the borders of the neighborhood. They saw the black Cadillacs idling on the corners. They begged Bumpy to let them strike first. But Bumpy remained calm, his eyes fixed on a higher goal. "Let them come to the door," he told them. "The lock is already turned from the inside." He was waiting for the perfect moment of maximum arrogance from Anastasia, the moment when the gift box would have the most devastating psychological impact. This wasn't just a defense of territory, it was a masterclass in deterrence. Bumpy was proving that the godfathers of New York were just men with families, men with routines, and men who could be touched. By choosing intelligence over violence, Bumpy was asserting a new kind of power in the underworld. He was showing that the mind is a far more lethal weapon than the submachine gun. The strategy was set, the pieces were in place, and the board was tipped in his favor. All that was left was the final delivery. Now, let me ask you, Is it more effective to defeat your enemy with a bullet or by showing them that you could have fired the bullet at any time? Does true power come from the act of violence or from the threat of it? I want to hear your take in the comments. This is the thin line between a gangster and a strategist. And if you're gripping your seat waiting for the moment Anastasia opens that box, hit that subscribe button right now. The climax is coming, and it's a sound that changed history. The air in the Ravenite Social Club didn't just feel cold, it felt dead. Every man in that room was a professional dealer of death, yet as Albert Anastasia's fingers gripped the lid of the box sent by Bumpy Johnson, the silence was heavier than a tombstone. Anastasia, the man who had laughed at Bumpy's name just moments before, now looked like he was holding a live grenade. He pulled the lid back slowly, the cardboard screeching against the tension in the room. The first thing he saw wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a severed finger or a dead animal. It was a stack of photographs. But these weren't just any photos. Anastasia's hand began to tremble, a sight his men had never seen in their lives. The top photo was a clear, high-angle shot of Anastasia's own back porch in Fort Lee, New Jersey. In the center of the frame was his young daughter, playing with a ball, completely unaware that someone was watching from the trees. Anastasia flipped to the next one. It was a photo of his wife through a grocery store window 3 days prior. The next was a shot of his brother, Tough Tony, walking into a private meeting that was supposed to be a secret even from the FBI. Each photograph was accompanied by a small, handwritten note on the back. No threats, no insults, just the exact time and date the photo was taken, and the name of the man who could have pulled a trigger instead of a camera shutter. But there was one more thing at the bottom of the box. A heavy brass object. Anastasia reached in and pulled out a house key. His eyes went wide, his breath hitching in his throat. He recognized the shape. It was the key to his own front door. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just watched him from the streets. Bumpy's men had been inside his home while he slept. They had walked through his hallways, stood over his carpets, and instead of taking his life, they had simply taken a copy of his key. The message was louder than any explosion. It was the ultimate psychological checkmate. Bumpy was telling the Lord High Executioner of the Mafia, "You think you are the hunter, but you are the prey. I can touch your children. I can touch your wife. I can walk into your bedroom while you dream. Your money, your soldiers, and your reputation can't protect you from a man you can't see." Anastasia slammed the lid back on the box, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The laughter from earlier was a distant memory. The capos around the table looked at each other, the fear visible in their eyes. They realized in that moment that they weren't fighting a gang war. They were being hunted by a ghost. Bumpy Johnson had stripped away Anastasia's invincibility in 10 seconds. The genius of Bumpy's move was its surgical precision. If he had killed Anastasia, the 5 families would have burned Harlem to the ground in a blood feud that lasted decades. But by showing him the key and the photos, Bumpy gave Anastasia a choice: peace, or the total destruction of everything he loved. He didn't attack the Mafia's business. He attacked the Mafia boss's peace of mind. Anastasia stood up, his face a mask of pale fury and suppressed panic. He didn't order a retaliation. He didn't call for his gunman. He looked at Tony the banker, the man who thought he had bought a traitor in Bumpy's crew, and he threw the box at his chest. "We're done," Anastasia whispered, his voice shaking with a cold rage. "Get the men out of Harlem. Now. We don't go back there. Not today. Not ever." The word spread through the underworld within hours. The invincible Gambino family had backed down. The Lord High Executioner had been silenced by a gift box from a man he called a street hood. Bumpy Johnson had won the war for Harlem without spilling a single drop of Italian blood. He had played the game at a level the Mafia didn't even know existed. He proved that true power isn't about who has the most guns, but about who knows where the enemy sleeps. Back in Harlem at the St. Nicholas pub, Bumpy was informed that the black Cadillacs had pulled back from the borders. He didn't celebrate. He didn't brag. He simply finished his cognac, adjusted his fedora, and went back to the business of looking after his people. He had saved his neighborhood, protected his throne, and taught the most dangerous men in the world a lesson they would never forget. The contents of that box became the stuff of legend, a story, whispered in the shadows of Little Italy for generations. It wasn't just about the photos or the key. It was about the realization that Bumpy Johnson was the one man the mafia couldn't buy, couldn't break, and couldn't kill. He was the king of Harlem, and that night, the world finally recognized his crown. I want to see the comments blowing up right now. Was this the greatest move in the history of the underworld? Could any other man have pulled this off against Albert Anastasia? This is the moment where strategy beats brute force every single time. And if you're as hyped as I am about this reveal, you better have hit that like button. This is why we tell these stories, because the truth is crazier than any movie Hollywood could ever make. The dust from the Ravenite incident eventually settled, but the power dynamic of New York City had been permanently altered. Bumpy Johnson didn't just save Harlem that day. He redefined what it meant to be a leader in the EI underworld. He taught the five families and the world that brutality has its limits, but intelligence is boundless. While the mafia operated on fear, Bumpy operated on leverage. He understood that a man's greatest fear isn't death, but the realization that he is no longer in control. The lesson was simple: never mistake silence for weakness. The Italians thought Bumpy's quiet nature was a sign of submission, but in reality, he was just listening, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to strike. He proved that you don't need to be the biggest wolf in the forest if you're the one who knows where all the traps are set. For the rest of his life, Bumpy remained the undisputed king of Harlem, a man who could walk through any street in New York with his head held high, knowing that even his fiercest enemies respected the mind behind the muscle. But every victory comes with a price. Bumpy's move against Anastasia solidified his crown, but it also painted a permanent target on his back for years to come. The underworld never forgets, and as the 1960s approached, a new breed of criminal began to emerge. Men who didn't care about the old codes of honor or the tactical games of chess. Men who were younger, hungrier, and far more chaotic. Bumpy had survived the mafia, but could he survive the changing tides of his own neighborhood? Could he hold on to the soul of Harlem as heroin began to flood the streets, brought in by the very people he had fought so hard to keep out? That is a story of betrayal, shifting loyalties, and a final stand that almost cost Bumpy everything he had built. Next week, we are going deep into the dark side of the 1960s Harlem, the rise of Frank Lucas, the fall of the old guard, and the one mistake Bumpy Johnson made that he could never take back. It's a story of a mentor and a student, and a betrayal that was years in the making. You don't want to miss the fall of the Padrino. Make sure you've subscribed and turned on those notifications. The streets have more stories to tell, and you're only hearing them here. Stay sharp, stay loyal, and as always, watch your back. See you in the next one.